Welcome to the second episode of the Social Exchange. I'm your host, Mary Blackburn. Now, before we dive into today's episode, I would like to make a disclaimer as we will be discussing abuse in this interview. Now, due to this very reason, we have actually added some resources into our description. These are places you can visit in person, call, text, or even email. So if you or someone that is close to you is dealing with abuse, please feel free to utilize any and all of these resources. And of course, pass them along to anyone you think might need them. Now, to tell you a little bit more about today's episode, I had the pleasure of sitting down with Kiara Nicholson, who works at the Hays-Caldwell Women's Center in San Marcos, Texas. And we discussed abuse in childhood and adulthood, and especially pertaining to relationships, as well as where we hope humanity is headed in light of recent events such as the Me Too movement, as well as Time's Up. So without further ado, here is the second episode of the Social Exchange, and thank you so much for listening. Welcome to the second episode of the Social Exchange. I am sitting with Kiara Nicholson. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Kiara. As you mentioned, I'm a prevention educator at the Hays-Caldwell Women's Center. We serve victims of abuse, sexual assault and abuse, child abuse, and dating and domestic violence, anybody who lives or works in Hays and Caldwell County. But I don't do any direct services. For my job, I have the job of trying to prevent sexual violence or dating and domestic violence in the community. So I mostly have conversations with middle school and high school students about that, but I do some work at the University of Texas State too.
That's very interesting. How did you get into that field, and how long have you been working in it?
I've been doing it for about 5 years as staff. I did a semester-long internship before that. And I got into it because I also was a sociology student at Texas State.
Awesome.
And I took the family problems class, and I needed an internship, and somebody came and they did the presentation on domestic violence, about why people stay in abusive relationships. And at the time, I didn't know that I was in an abusive relationship, or at least it was sometimes abusive. And I was having a really tough semester as a result of it, and was trying to look for an internship, and it was the one presentation that I remembered, and I ended up applying for the internship. I got it, and then through the internship, I learned that this is something that's really important to me, and I want to have conversations with people about relationships, unhealthy and healthy relationships, because nobody talked to me about it when I was younger. So I want to be a person to talk to other people about it.
That's really awesome that you do that work. I think that there's not a lot of people that even know that that's an option to go into that field. So specifically with the age group that you are working in, what are some of the differences that you've noticed and some of the important elements of really talking to younger people about this subject and about abusive relationships? How does that whole process work for you?
I would say that first, just like my experience, nobody's talking to them about it. The adults in their lives aren't talking to them about it, but they are spending a lot of time on the internet where they're getting a lot of information about it. And sometimes it's good information and accurate information, and sometimes it's problematic and not so good information. So it's very similar to when I was their age, middle school and high school, to where nobody was talking to them about it, or if they do, it's sort of like, you're too young to be in a relationship, you don't really know what love is. But for them, it feels very real. And I think it's doing them a disservice if we don't talk to them about it, because they're already forming beliefs and attitudes about what they think a healthy or an unhealthy relationship looks like, and then it's starting to get solidified in who they are. Not to say that it can't change, but it's starting to form when they're very young, and then the adults in their lives don't talk to them about it at all, or they do talk to them about it and they wait till they're like 17 or 18, which oftentimes they've already experienced a lot of unhealthy things in their relationships.
Yeah, especially in American culture. One of the things that I learned very little bit about this past semester is I read a study done, and I believe it was comparing American parents to Dutch parents and the concern of sexuality and teens becoming sexually active, as they say, and how different it is between how Americans deal with it. It's very much like, don't have sex, don't enter relationships, you can't handle it, and you can't have a serious relationship, you really don't love that person, versus the Dutch really try to combine both educating their children about sex and also about relationships. Like those go hand in hand. Do you think that that's a really huge part on how you said that it's so belittling to younger kids? And you really feel so much when you're young. And to say that that's inadequate and not real must be confusing and paying them, as you said, a total disservice, because those feelings are real. And even though you're young, you can feel things very intensely.
Yeah,
and to have
sure.
like these adults that are discrediting you must be very harmful, along with having relationships that could be very unhealthy. So it's a really bad combination. Do you think that that's specific? Obviously, you can't say like overall, but is that something that you think is perpetuated by the way America teaches people about relationships?
For sure, I would agree with you. And I've heard the same thing about the Dutch, how they talk about relationships with young people, and that they do talk about relationships and they're comfortable talking about sex even at a young age. And America doesn't, usually in the United States, we don't want to talk about sex. And if we are talking about it, we're not adding the part about relationships. And that part gets left out a lot, where we talk to them about like, well, if you do have sex, then X, Y, and Z can happen to you. And it's usually around like STIs. But nobody's really talking to them about consent. And if they are talking to them about consent, which is left out most of the time, but if they are, it's usually like yes means yes and no means no, which is great, but there's a lot that gets left out of that. Like, what does yes look like? What does no look like? Can somebody be saying no without actually verbally saying
right? There's a
no?
whole gray area that I think we're trying to dive into with the Me Too movement and Time's Up and a lot of stuff that's been going on in the past year.
Yeah.
And sadly, for myself at least, my experience has been that we've lost a lot of chances to talk about those gray areas when it comes to consent and abuse of all different kinds.
Yeah.
No matter the age, no matter the gender. But I think there's been a few cases where I think that the situation was gray, but we feel that we must be so polarized and we have to make very concrete decisions on subjects. So there were even cases where I was kind of like, maybe this was a little gray. Maybe the dude didn't know he was doing something bad, doesn't validate what he did. And then I felt bad because I was like, oh, I'm a horrible person. I'm not seeing this for what it is. Like, this person's evil and bad. But there are really gray areas that we haven't been able to educate people on about what consent looks like. And we need to start that at a much younger age in our schools and in our homes. And how do we even do that? That's a really tricky thing because everybody's idea of what it is so different.
Yeah, and I've felt the same way where people, it can feel, what is the word that I want to use? Sometimes people don't want to humanize people who commit abusive behaviors or do abusive behaviors against somebody else, because we do think of it very black and white, as you're saying. It's like either you're a person who knows not to do this, or you're a person who's done this thing and now there's no hope for you, and this is where you're going to end up for the rest of your life. You can't possibly change. But people aren't born doing these things. Like, there's a small percentage of people who may be like born not caring about other people.
Right.
And then the rest of people, like, we learn it along the way. Like, we're socialized and we're told don't do this, but oftentimes we're not really told like the healthy things to replace that with.
Yeah.
So there becomes a lot of gray areas. And then whenever you're talking about like, well, no means no, and they're like, okay, well, this person didn't say no, so I thought I was fine, and now people are talking about that I'm a rapist or I assaulted somebody, and I don't really know how to come back from this. And sometimes people want to do better and they want to get help, but there's not really a lot of resources out there for people who are like, okay, maybe I did mess up, or maybe nobody talked to me about this, so how do I learn different? But the only feedback that they're getting is like, you're this terrible person and you have to fix this on your own, and then don't give them resources to do that.
Yeah, and I think they don't have resources, they don't have a support system, and it's complicated because, you know, if I was in that situation, I'd be like, they don't deserve those things.
Yeah,
and it's hard not to. I remember when everything was coming out about Harvey Weinstein, Bryan Cranston from Breaking Bad tweeted out something about how with
for instance, Louis C.K. and Harvey Weinstein and all the different stories that were coming up at the same time.
Yeah.
We need to look at a case-by-case basis, and there's obviously an epidemic going on, and we need to kind of dive into this. Those were his exact words. I don't have the tweet up right now, so I don't know exactly, but he got kind of put under blast for that. And people got really mad at him because they were saying he was siding with these abusers instead of the victims. And I don't think that that's what he meant. I also understand where people are coming from, because you're finally getting the chance to have your voices heard. And it's like, I don't want to be on the side of these abusers anymore.
Yeah.
Like, we have been on the side of silence for so long, and now we're having this momentum. So it's a very conflicting.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Because they're like, with people like Weinstein, like it's easy to demonize somebody who does things like that. Or like our president, who's currently like in the White House, it can be easy to demonize that.
Yeah.
But then you have people like Aziz Ansari.
I'm so glad you brought up his case.
Yeah,
yes.
and a lot of people, and we talk about this in our office where I work with other prevention educators a lot about, a lot of people are a fan of the comedy that Aziz Ansari does, because a lot of it is using comedy to talk about things like this that are happening in the community. I've watched comedy specials where he's talked about like the quote unquote creepy guy who's doing like what we stereotype as something that's a problem.
Yeah.
And then in the news, they're talking about somebody coming forward and saying that Aziz Ansari pushed their boundaries and maybe assaulted them and didn't do something that they were comfortable with. So what do we do with that? Because we have this idea in our mind of what this person is going to look like, but anybody's capable of doing this, and that can be really difficult for people to sort of internalize.
That's so beautifully put. Not beautiful, but like very well put. And along with, not only can anyone be an abuser, anyone can be abused.
Yeah.
And so with that, I definitely want to talk. I don't want to make it men versus women or anything, but there's definitely a hidden side of abuse where men can't come forward. And I really do want to talk about that, because I definitely think it's important to talk about all sides of it. And a lot of the time, men that are abused, they don't get to come forward. And a lot, even through, we've been talking a lot about the Me Too movement, but through that, I remember there were cases where men would come speak up, and a lot of the time they were not met with the same support that women were. So what is this side of men that are victims of abuse? And I know you said you work at the Hays-Caldwell Women's Center. It's called the Women's Center, but y'all also help children and men and women of all different ages and gender. So how does that side work? Because it gets so little conversation about that.
Does. But as you said, a lot of people don't talk about men experiencing abuse, because a lot of the narrative is around like men being perpernators.
Right. And it's understandable, because factually,
statistically,
women, it is hugely outnumbered that women are much more vulnerable to that than men.
Yeah,
but that doesn't mean
like men commit more crimes, and it's not that men are more likely to do it, or like it's not that it's innate in them as men, it's like the way that they're socialized.
Yes, I completely agree.
That they're not really socialized to talk about their feelings or connect with other people, or if they are encouraged to have an emotion, it's anger. And then sometimes people overcompensate, or they just do the best with what they have, and sometimes that's seen in a form of violence. But there are men who don't do that, or men who experience abuse and then nobody talks about what it's like for them. And as you mentioned, our agency does serve men, and we have men who come and receive our services all the time, and they stay in our shelter. And a lot of people don't know that, because our name is Women's Center. It's a historical name. A lot of people do want to change it, but there are a lot of people who do want to hold on to it for that historical significance. But there are a lot of societal influences that make it to where men don't want to come forward, because society generally believes that it can't happen to men, or maybe you're less of a man if a female partner is perpetrating violence against you. But we're doing a disservice to men by not talking about it, because they're not getting help. And then there are a lot of men or masculine people who are being left out of the conversation, because a lot of the times when we do talk about it, it's very heterosexual, where it's men who are perpetrating abuse against a female partner, but then there are a lot of men who aren't straight who are experiencing it as well. And then when we don't talk about men, we're leaving out not just straight men, but men in general.
Right. Yeah, the masculine in all of its different forms. And that's where a lot of it is kind of hiding in these little pockets that you can't even get to, that you don't even see. And I'm sure it's much bigger than we could even imagine. Just in general with all the different identities there are and how complicated it is for them to get help, because they're already having a hard time being seen for who they are. And on top of that, the abuse that follows that that journey is it's very hard for us to even kind of grasp, because we haven't even really accepted the way that that those people identify themselves and who they are. So do you experience a lot of varying degrees of different combinations of abuse, and it comes in all different forms? So let me try to word that better. Now, since y'all are a help center, is it only normally physical abuse that people are experiencing when they come to you? Is it verbal? Is it mental? Is it I know those all kind of come in hand, but do they wait for it to get physical until they come to you most of the time?
I would say I do agree with you that it's usually all of them that we see. I don't do a lot of direct services, so I can't speak on the day to day, but I would say that in general, a lot of people may possibly wait until it's physical, because emotional abuse or like unhealthy communication or like problematic communication that could potentially be verbal and emotional abuse is pretty commonplace. We're not really taught healthy communication a lot of the time. So a lot of people just think it's normal and they don't recognize it for what it is. And a lot of the conversations that we do have about abusive relationships are about physical abuse. So a lot of people think like, well, I didn't know that my relationship was abusive because they didn't put their hands on me. Yeah,
and I've heard people say that. My entire life, and that's it's always kind of jarring to hear that sometimes you still feel like that. And I knew growing up, it kind of took me and I'm still working through what is abuse and what is not abuse. And I remember you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that when you first took the family problems class here at the Texas State University, you didn't realize that you were in an abusive relationship. You were in college. It took until a professor was talking about it in a classroom for you to realize what was going on. And some people don't even get the moment of having that.
And even then, like as I was sitting in the class, I didn't really connect any of the dots. It wasn't until I got my internship, because I interned at Hays-Caldwell Women's Center, and I was going through our volunteer advocate training and really learning about the dynamics. And I was like, this kind of sounds like my relationship, and this makes a lot of sense on why I've been feeling the way that I've been feeling. Or why I know that my relationship isn't good, but I don't think it's abusive because they didn't put their hands on me. And something that we do see at our agency, and not just at our agency, but people who call hotlines. I've heard that some people say that they wish that the abuse was just physical, because then their bodies can heal from it and they move on. And it's the emotional and the verbal abuse that really sticks with people. So it's really unfortunate because they don't recognize it as being a problem at first, but that's what sticks with them in the long run.
Yeah, and with that, this kind of directly leads into my next question. What are the mental and physical health negative effects of abuse? Specifically, you work with children and high schoolers a lot. I remember in your presentation, for our listeners, you came and spoke at the family problems class that I took this semester, which is how we met. I remember you saying that victims of abuse actually experience major PTSD. And that comes a lot into what you were just saying. So what are some of the lasting effects for your mental state? And even some of, obviously, PTSD is also very physical as well. So let's talk a little bit about that.
Some of those lasting effects include depression, anxiety, eating disorders, which people don't really think about, but for some people who have eating disorders, it's a way to maintain control over an area in their life where they feel like they're not really feeling a lot of control. Substance abuse, and then PTSD, as you were saying. A lot of the times when we have conversations about PTSD, it's around veterans, specifically veterans who've gone to or come back from war. And statistically, the rates of PTSD are higher in people who've experienced domestic violence and sexual assault in comparison to those of veterans.
Wow.
Yeah, almost by a large margin.
Wow.
A lot higher. But we don't really talk about it because not a lot of people know that it's an issue.
Now, I've never been in the military, and so I don't know very much about how PTSD works for veterans, so I just want to come forward with that. But with victims of abuse that experience major PTSD, is that because it's more interpersonal and it's much closer and constant versus, I believe, I don't know what my perception is of what it would be like, but when you are, a soldier, a lot of it, maybe I feel like you can kind of separate a little bit more because you can put a lot of reasoning behind it, and it's for your country, and it makes a lot of sense. Right. And versus, with, and I'm sure that this happens in the Army as well, but with victims of abuse, when it's happening, especially with someone that they're close to, that's a much more psychologically damaging, I would feel, because there's this battle of, oh, this person's supposed to care for me and they're supposed to love me. Maybe this is what love is. And a lot of the stuff that we tell ourselves when we are in the middle of abuse.
Right. I would say, and I also have never been in the military and don't know as much about PTSD, but PTSD is usually as a result of experiencing something traumatic. So people can have PTSD from going to war zones, from experiencing abuse, from being in a car accident. People can experience PTSD for a number of different things. So I would say it's largely from experiencing something traumatic, but I would say that I could see the argument that being so close to someone and then experiencing abuse as a result of your relationship with them can be very traumatic. And it's something that stays with you and it's lasting. And I think of the science behind sexual assault survivors and counselors at the Women's Center who've talked about the science behind it and the way that your brain will react to trauma, and the trauma response to the brain. There's a certain part of your brain that goes offline. It can, not to say that it always will. And you will start to encode the things like smells or focus on something that's going on in the room, like a ceiling fan or something. And those are the things that sort of get imprinted in the mind while the rest of it is sort of going offline during a traumatic experience. So then people will experience flashbacks, which a lot of people can associate with PTSD. And those flashbacks can be long-term. So I would say that it's very similar from just experiencing a trauma and then your body internalizing that trauma in a number of different ways, and then internalizing it in the form of like your senses, like your 5 senses, and holding on to those memories in that way.
Now, along with long-term PTSD and mental health issues that can surface, what are the cases where, for instance, if a child or a teenager, if their parents are abusive to one another, but not necessarily abusive to them, what are the effects of that? Is that still, would someone that is experienced association to a really abusive relationship, would they still be able to come to the Hays-Caldwell Center, or how much do y'all know about the effects of that?
I want to say that we do know a lot. We do have counselors on staff where their job is to counsel children who've witnessed domestic violence in their homes, because it does have lasting effects. And it's very similar effects to people who experience domestic violence, like depression, anxiety, the potential for substance abuse or eating disorders. But it's also like a lack of focus or withdrawing or acting out in some way or feeling guilt and shame. And some people will stay in their relationships for a number of reasons, like their abusive relationships. And they think, well, it's okay because they're not abusing the children or the children don't see it. And children see everything, whether we realize it or not.
Right.
And it is affecting them, unfortunately. So we do have counselors at our agency who do specifically see children who witness domestic violence, because we do know that it can have long-term effects on them too, just from being in a home where it's happening.
And one of the things that you just mentioned there was that a lot of the time it takes people a long time to leave their abuser, and a lot of the time they'll go back because they're like, oh, they didn't hurt the kids. I can still be with them. So what is the cycle of abuse, and how does one break it? Obviously, that's kind of a very generic question,
right?
And it's to each individual. But let's talk about a little bit of the cycle of abuse with that.
So statistically, it takes a person about an average of 7 times to successfully leave an abusive relationship, sometimes more, sometimes less. And people will talk about it in the form of like a cycle of abuse, as you were mentioning before. So you start out in your relationship and things are good, and then maybe they start to not be as good, and you'll start to see some of those warning signs or red flags, as we call them, where they text you and they call you a little bit more than you're comfortable with, or you feel like you're constantly having to reply to them. Or maybe you start to feel yourself getting more afraid of them, or you start to make excuses for their behavior where things aren't as happy anymore, and you notice that things are off, and then maybe it can escalate into something that's a little bit more abusive. Maybe this is the first time that they hit you, or maybe they're tracking you through your cell phone is starting to get more extreme, or maybe you feel not as happy in their relationship, and then they start to apologize for it if you bring it to their attention, or they realize that they're doing it, and maybe it's getting you gifts, or saying like, I'm going to work on it, or I'm having just a stressful day at work or a stressful time at school, and it's going to get better, and then it happens again. Usually it does happen again, and it doesn't have to be that it happens from day to day. It can happen over a course of months, over a course of a few years. But the fact that it happened more than once means that it's a cycle of abuse. And sometimes it can be difficult to get out of that cycle, because just like healthy relationships, abusive and unhealthy relationships start out good too. Like you care about this person, you love them potentially. So there are good parts that are going on, or maybe they're not abusive all the time. So you do enjoy time that you spend with them sometimes. Or maybe it's to a point where you're dependent on them economically. You don't make a lot of money, or you don't make any of your own money, and they make money, and you're dependent on them for paying your bills, or if you have children together, getting things for your children. Or you feel social pressure to stay together, like your friends and your family are telling you, like, hey, work it out, or maybe like your faith community is something that's very important to you, and you're getting an influence from your faith community of you made this commitment before God or whoever it is that you believe in, so you need to stay together and you need to work this out. So there are a number of reasons why people do stay, and that's one of the most common questions we get is like, why would you be in a relationship with somebody who's doing this to you? And we know that there are a number of reasons why people end up staying, but we don't always question why people are doing it. And I think it's because there's, for a number of reasons, but one of them being like there's just a lack of resources for people who are doing it. Oftentimes it takes to them getting to this extreme end where they're convicted of doing something, and then there's batterer intervention programs, but we got to do something before people get into a batterer intervention program, right? Like people need to be able to talk more about their relationships, because nobody's talking to them about it when they're younger, when they're forming their ideas of what a relationship should be.
And that kind of ties into what we were talking earlier, because we really can't wait for it to get that bad, because there's so many steps that you can take to prevent it. And that's not at the victims at all. That's just to society. I want to make that clear, that is not to these people that are out of resources, that didn't get the chance to be exposed to healthy relationships and know what that's like. That's to how we build relationships as a society, how we educate people on it. Now, so what happens if they don't have resources. I know we kind of went over this in your presentation. Would you be able to tell our listeners a little bit of, I don't want to say like the worst case scenario, but kind of what ends up happening? I know when you had your presentation, you talked about how they run out of resources and they end up either having to go back home or they're homeless because they, now I do believe that this is correct, but please correct me if I'm wrong. Families with children are one of the fastest growing homeless groups in America.
Yeah.
Correct?
But specifically women with children. Amongst women with children, 80%, or women with children who experience homelessness, over 80% of them have experienced domestic violence at some point. And 63, I want to say, % of women who are homeless experience domestic violence as adults, whether they have children or not. So it's one of the leading causes of homelessness for women, specifically women with children, because sometimes you run out of those resources, and home is a place that may be the only resource, or if you really need to leave because it's for the safety of you and your children, then you leave, and whether you have resources or not. And sometimes that resource is hopefully a homeless shelter in your community, which is unfortunate that for a number of women, that's the only option they feel like they have.
And that's something I didn't know before you came and spoke to us in class. I didn't know that families, specifically women with children and female identities with children, were the fastest growing homeless group, because you don't see them, you know?
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of the time what's hard about abuse, about homelessness, and about the whole conversation is we talk about what we see.
Right.
And if we don't see it, it's not happening.
Right.
And it doesn't need to be talked about. And that's what's very disheartening about really trying to tackle it, because sometimes I remember when I was younger, especially just talking about abuse towards women specifically, about sexual harassment and rape, and so many things that I was seeing in very, micro levels just growing up. I remember, and this also has to do probably with where I grew up, but I grew up in the Bible Belt. It's a beautiful, wonderful place. Right. But I remember trying to have conversations about rape culture and a lot of the inequality that women face. And I remember people really telling me that it wasn't true, that that's really not how things are, and kind of trying to convince me otherwise. I would be like, I want to talk about this, or even bringing up something simple like, I'm a feminist. I think that these issues should be heard for both men and women, and be like, no, I don't think it does, because I don't see it. Right. And so I think a lot of the time I would get really frustrated about that, but I have to kind of take a step back and be like, this person's either in denial or they truly live such a great life they don't see this. Right. Which, good for you, I guess.
Yeah. But that's how abuse works. Like, it thrives in silence. Yes. If everybody knows it's going on, people are probably going to be a little bit more likely to want to do something about it.
Exactly. Now, I don't know if this is something that you've been able to track, but do you feel like more people have been coming forward to the Hays-Caldwell Women's Center since the breakout of the Me Too movement and Time's Up, and this discussion being a lot more open? Has that affected people's ability to kind of take that step forward to getting protection or help? Have you noticed any shift with that, or has it really not?
That I don't know, but I do know that our numbers continue to increase every year across all of our programs. And some people do wonder, like, are more people being sexually assaulted? And it's like, no, it's not that more people are being sexually assaulted. I do think that more people are, either recognizing that what happened to them was sexual assault or abuse, or it did happen to them and they're ready to talk about it now. Or for a number of reasons, now they're like, now I know what resources are available to me. So I would say that maybe it's correlated that with like Me Too and Time's Up, more people are coming forward. And that's one of the questions we also get is like, if it happened to you such a long time ago, why are you talking about it now? Which can be very frustrating. But we know that previously, like, it thrives in silence. So a lot of times victims of abuse aren't believed, like, that it's actually happening to them. Yeah. So when you try to go out and you want to get help, you're not believed, or if you're choosing to go through the criminal justice system, it's like being victimized all over again.
Right.
Because people are talking to you and they're asking you a lot of questions, like, are you sure this is what happened to you?
Yeah.
What were you wearing? Who were you spending time with? Did you say yes at some point and you changed your mind? Making it seem like what happened to them is their fault. Yeah. And then it takes so long that if people do end up, having evidence against the person that did assault them, specifically when we're talking about sexual assault, getting to a courtroom where you're trying a person in court for that, even making it to trial, the statistics is very low. I want to say it's like 2%. And then from that 2%, it's probably 2% of those who actually get convictions.
Right.
So hearing that, a lot of people don't want to come forward. And then when you have movements like Me Too and Time's Up, and you see other people talking about previous experiences, it's like, maybe this is my time, because there's power in numbers, right?
Right.
Like, maybe now that all of us are saying that this is happening to us, maybe people are going to start to believe us now, and maybe I can actually do something about it now. So I guess that was a very long way of saying that it's not that people wait to talk about it, it's just, it can be very discouraging to talk about it, and scary to talk about it right when it's first happening to you.
Right. And also you kind of talked about the legal side of it. I think so much of not wanting to come forward is what you kind of tell yourself, like, what's the point?
Right.
Like, you're going to be victimized again. You don't have the resources. You don't have a lawyer. Even if you do have a lawyer and all the money, it's going to take years to get a hearing, and then dealing with the publicity of that, if you're famous or if you're not.
It's hard.
Yeah.
And it takes so long.
Yeah.
It takes about 2 years to even get to that point. And a lot of people, they just want to be past it.
Yeah.
It's like, I've moved past this, and now you're contacting me about this legal case, and I don't want to have to bring this up again.
Right.
So they don't want to do it. And another issue that we see that's sort of connected is the backlog of testing rape kits. People, whenever they go to hospitals, they can get a sexual assault kit done that swabs and looks for evidence, and then it's saved, and then it can be sent off to a lab to be tested for the evidence and held. But there is a big backlog of testing those rape kits, and it takes a very long time to test them now, because there's so many of them, and it takes a lot of money because there's so many of them. So there's not a lot of money or other resources to test those. And so not having those tested, we're losing the opportunity to catch repeat offenders, because there's a small percentage of people who are like sexually assaulting people, and a lot of them are repeat offenders. And then by not testing them, it sort of holds up people's ability to like go through with getting that evidence out there, because there's such a backlog. And then say they do want to go forward with it in the future, and then they want to get their kit tested, and then it's taking forever to get done, they could run out of their statute of limitations, which I believe is 5 years for the state of Texas for adults anyway. So there's a lot of things, at least within the criminal justice system, that are working against victims and survivors to come forward and talk about it.
Yeah, I think that's something that one of the many plus sides that's come with the technological age of social media, and with the movements that we've been talking so much about, is that you don't need a lawyer anymore. You need a Twitter and Instagram.
Yeah, exactly.
And, even if Harvey Weinstein, I don't even, he's off wherever. But, even with cases like that, even if it never made it to trial, that person's career is done.
Right.
And there's a lot of power in that, and being able to kind of take that into your own hands and say, you know what, I acknowledge that the way that our criminal justice system is right now works against a lot of people all across the board.
Yes.
And, we're just talking about one little small part of it, but being able to say, well, I'll just find my way around that, I think is something I didn't think I would see in my lifetime. Right. That really happened so fast, and I really hope it doesn't lose its momentum. I think there's a lot of pluses with it, but one, I wouldn't even call it a negative, but one thing that I think is kind of interesting about the way that we've been using it. I've talked to friends and a couple different people about how, along with the Me Too movement and all the stories that were coming up, so many of my own past traumatic events kind of resurfaced.
Yeah.
And I know a lot of people were experiencing that.
Yeah.
And a lot of, luckily, even on social media, a lot of people were coming out saying, you know, even if someone's not speaking up doesn't mean it didn't happen to them.
Exactly.
And you can say that, and you can say it, and I do think it's important to say it, but I think that people don't really understand that a lot of the time. And I think there's something, especially with how it came out in Hollywood, which is, you know, the whole world is corrupt and riddled with a lot of abuse, but especially in Hollywood, with all of this breaking out of Hollywood, I think one thing that has been interesting is we already naturally expect so much out of celebrities, and we kind of think that because their very job is the nature of empathy, that we think, because I've seen you at your most vulnerable in this film, I deserve your most vulnerable personally. And if you are not leading this march, then it's not going to happen. And so there's a lot of pressure I felt for these people that a lot of the time, you know, if they did want to talk about it, and if it was a long time ago, I think that's totally fine. But there was a lot of pressure for them to have to tell these stories that weren't ours to make them tell. And I think that there's a big problem with having to, you were talking about how you have to take all these swabs, and there's all this this really crazy side to it that's to make it believable, and we have to go into such great detail, and we have to tell these stories, and it's like no one deserves these, and even if I don't tell you, it doesn't mean it didn't happen, and that doesn't mean justice shouldn't be served for me or against this person. And that's something that I've been a little bit I know hopefully we'll get there, but a lot of the conversations, save for a few of them, and those few are important, a lot of the time it has been like big businesses like Harvey Weinstein, like comedians and this actor, and it's like, okay, but sometimes it's your best friend. Sometimes it's a family member. Sometimes it's someone you've known for a really long time, and a lot of the stories don't really tap into that. I think one that came out that was a little interesting, and I think they really did try to get into the grayness of some of these situations, was Uma Thurman and Quentin Tarantino. She was like, he's my friend, but I also am understanding that what he did was not okay. And she waited to tell that story, and I think she told it how she, I think she came at it where she wanted to the public to know this story. So luckily for her story, I think it was something that was voluntary, but I think a lot of the time with a lot of those stories that are so gray, it's even harder to come forward. And for me, and I've experienced, so I've had a great lucky life where I haven't had too much trauma, but even with the minor things that have happened, I'm like, I don't just owe anyone this information, and I think people need to know that. And I think that we need to find ways where just because you don't need to tell your story, we still have to find a way to teach people moving forward. So I guess with that, we've talked a lot about where we've been, where we are currently. Where do you think we need to go with how we treat abuse on both sides, both the perpetuator and the victims? We've talked a lot about how we need to educate people at younger ages about relationships. So what's some of your advice or kind of your hope for a better future with that?
Well, I'm thinking about what you just said about a lot of times we don't think that it's somebody that we know usually that it's happening to them. Or at least like it's somebody that we know and we trust or like we look up to. And a lot of times whenever we do talk about abuse, it's somebody that we don't know, or maybe a person we went on a first date with, or like the person who like attacked us when we're in a parking lot or something. And statistically, 1 in 4 women are going to experience sexual assault or abuse, and that doesn't compute for a lot of people because they're like, 1 in 4 women can't possibly be attacked by somebody that they don't know. But something that I hope for the future is like that we have more conversations about like oftentimes it is somebody that you know and you trust and you look up to. So having more conversations about what it looks like, hopefully getting the backlog tested.
That would be.
Because that would be great. It would help a lot of people having more of those conversations about what consent looks like in relationships. But I hope that people continue to have conversations and that the momentum doesn't die down. And we try to change our policies, or at least the way that our criminal justice system works to help people. But I also hope that people will have more conversations in the way that we socialize people to think about sex and relationships, and what it means to be a person, and like our gendered expectations. And the work that I do, part of it is primary prevention of sexual violence, and that's trying to address the root causes, both risk and protective factors, on what will make somebody more likely to perpetrate violence against somebody else. So I'm hoping that we can have more of those conversations when people are younger, that it's okay if your son cries or doesn't want to play football. It doesn't mean that he's going to be gay, and if he is gay, that's okay too.
Yeah, that's great.
And that women should be able to dress more comfortably with what they want to wear, and it doesn't mean that it's an invitation for like harassment, or it's a statement about who she is as a person, or that you're able to commit violence against her.
Right.
Or that there are people who don't exist within the binary of male and female that experience abuse too. And then when we talk about it in terms of a male perpetrator and a female victim, there are a lot of voices and experiences that get left out of that. So I hope that the movement going forward continues to pull more people in and raise their voices up, because society continues to marginalize marginalized people. That's why they're marginalized people. And when their voices are left out, abuse just continues to happen to them, and there continues to be a lack of resources available for them. So I hope that we see more resources being available, and I hope that we see more resources being available for people to continue to work on learning what a healthy relationship looks like and what that means. Talking to young people, like, how do you want to treat somebody you're in a relationship with, and how do you want to be treated, including your friends? Because our parents, or at least our caregivers, are one of our first bases for learning about relationships, and as we get older, our friendships influence that, and then we start dating if that's something that we're interested in. So I hope that we continue to have more conversations. I would say that one of the best things we can do in general is just talk about things more, and talk about many different experiences, and try to change the systems that aren't working for people. But I think, as you said before, that I think we're doing a pretty good job.
I really have. Obviously, it's interesting. I obviously there's so much abuse that's still happening, and the system is still broken, and there's still a lot of problems. But just if I think back to a year or two ago, if we had tried to have this conversation, I feel like it would have been such a different conversation. And that's very encouraging in a lot of ways. That at least people are being heard, and the discussion is happening. To say that the discussion is happening is so solidifying.
Because we know the discussion in general has been happening over time. Like, we know that like movements like these aren't new, but with social media and like technology and things like that, it allows people to connect with more people who have more experience, like similar experiences, or connect with more resources. Or learn about things faster that they didn't even know was happening. And be able to empathize with other people better. I
think that's a really important part, is getting to that information and really learning how to empathize with all different kinds of people. And maybe that will all help us move to a state where we can treat people better.
Hopefully that's the ideal.
Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It was such a pleasure having you. Thank you for taking your time. Me. Oh, it was such a pleasure. And I guess we'll talk to you guys next time we have a podcast.
Thank you for making it all the way through this episode of The Social Exchange. Now, as promised, we will have some resources for you. Now, for local resources, we have the Hays-Caldwell Women's Center if you are in the Austin and San Marcos area. Now, I want to remind you that they help people of any gender and age. And for national resources, we have Love is Respect, National Domestic Violence Hotline, and RAINN. RAINN stands for Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. So that is RAINN. And they are the nation's largest anti-sexual violence organization. Now, we will be listing all of the numbers and websites for these organizations. So again, if you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please don't hesitate to utilize any of these sources and pass them along to anyone you think might need them. And thank you again for listening to the second episode of The Social Exchange.